Hey there everybody. Today's video is going to discuss design notes, and we're going to focus on pattern languages, structure in the forest, and horizons, dealing with how we think about age and cycling through the individuals that we have in our design. I want to note that this is not one of those here's how to put a guild together, although we will touch on that a little bit. This is more of a how does the function, absent the specific plants being put into the design, but how does the whole system function, and how can we go about doing the initial design work before we've fully resolved a plant list for ourselves or our site. I want to pause right here and say that we are going to be putting links into the description for each of the subtopics that we are going to be talking about. And so I encourage you all to take a look in the description, and if you see something that feels like it fits your site best or most appropriately, please feel free to skip to that section. I think that there's value in each of the topics that we're going to discuss, but this is going to get a little hairy and weedy, and I want to make sure that this kind of information is going to be pertinent to you without you having to search through. So please feel free to check the description, go to the chunk that looks like it's most suited for your site, and then join us for a conversation at the end. First up, we're going to talk about the pattern referred to as island. And an island pattern is when you have a standalone feature larger than the surrounding vegetation. This could be a large tree in the middle of a yard. This could be a set of shrubs in the middle of an old field. The big thing is that there are few of them, and they are defined by being set apart from the existing vegetation surrounding. And so I've drawn in a few things, and we're going to talk about it real quick. We have a house, our convention of north being up all the time. We have our house, a small trail leading to our large tree in the yard, and then maybe a few other small guys. But this is our big focus right here. And what we have is this one bush marked out here. A lot of times you want to have your bushes and smaller things in the drip line so that they are not having the water diverted away from them. So consider placement. But what we have are viable areas for shade-loving bushes, viable areas for sun-loving bushes, and then we also have the ability to put our herbs and ground cover into either undefined blobs, or we have the opportunity to select out and have specific placements along these if we so choose. If we are going to be adding in additional pieces, or if we have additional islands in our form or format on our site, then we have the ability to add additional structure to each of these islands, and we can grow this pattern by either having additional shrubs or bushes added in of a size that fit. We have the ability to put in an idea blob and say, in this context, I want 3 or 4 of a sun-loving perennial bush. I understand that there's going to be a good chunk of the day that is going to be shaded out potentially, depending on what the distance between these two items is. But it will get late afternoon sun, and it will get some early morning sun as well. If we wanted to divide up the sections of our ground cover under these, we have the ability to either blob them out like so and have them just be quadrants, We can divide this as large or small as we want. We could make this cardinal directions and have only 4 main aspects of it. We could go further and say 16 directions in it, or we can do a full 360 degrees around it and define every single aspect. But that feels like a lot of work and gets away from the general pattern building that we are working on here. So these are how we think about islands in the context of a food forest, and the expansion of them comes from the behaviors of the tree itself and its propagation strategies, the shrubs and ground covers that we add in and their propagation strategies. So if our bush here was a stoloniferous spreader, we could assume that over the course of a season or two, it would come and drop another one here and then send up another bush. And now we're going to start hopscotching and leapfrogging as these plants grow. Okay. Or through pruning and management, you can make it so that that doesn't actually happen, and we keep to our separate individual pieces in the site itself. Now we're going to talk about orchards. And before we get started, I want to just mention that the function of spacing in an orchard is directly related to the type of management you envision for the space. So if your plan involves the use of heavy machinery in it, I would say that your spacing needs to be appropriately distanced for the total growth size of the tree at its maturity, plus the space for the machine, and then the space for your full-grown other mature tree in that space. So if this diagram gets a little crowded, please understand that you can scale this out or down however it needs to be to fit your site and your needs and the design that you have in mind for the space you envision. That being said, our convention is going to be that we have a nitrogen fixing tree, a food producing tree. This can be fruit, this can be berries, this can be salad greens, this can be spices. It's just a crop that is produced that is edible. And then the last ones that we have are going to be our timber trees, because if we are going to be spending the time to grow these systems, then we should be planning to have several of the needs of the system, whether it's for more trellising or for pole wood or constructing fences to keep out wildlife, things of that nature. Timber is a replenishable resource if we plan our orchards correctly. So you'll notice we have north is the top of the page again. And so what we would do is we'd pick our tallest members are going to be on the back line, and this can be any of them. So we'll say most people are planting food first. So we're going to say that we have our tallest food trees on this back line. And that is our starting layout. And we often think of rows so that the tallest members in the back are receiving sunlight and are not shading out the ones that are further south. And that is specific to the people in the northern hemisphere. If you are in the southern hemisphere and you found this, g'day, welcome. Flip that and reverse it, and you're really just thinking poleward. And so we have our first row of trees. These are great. We want to expand, and we're thinking, oh my gosh, I don't want to shade anything out, but I'm nervous about how the sun is moving through my system and how the aspect of it is going to interact. What you can do is offset and have your nitrogen fixers in this system. so that instead of just one straight line north to south, we are now creating triads of food and nut trees or nitrogen fixers. And we have the ability to go this way or this way. And if we notice that the afternoon sun coming from this direction is particularly intense, then we can plant more sun-loving plants out in this direction. And we can also integrate more in this direction to capture those rays and plant smaller shade-loving things on the northern and eastern sides of these. Perhaps we have some timber trees as well, so we're going to say that we've done those here. And you'll notice that we can now draw triangles between food and nitrogen, or food, nitrogen, and timber, or nitrogen and timber, and nitrogen and timber. And a further wrinkle could be something like alternating which sets of trees we have in any given layout. So if we have two options, we can lay out our orchard in such a way as to create an even greater diversity in the rows themselves. And this will allow for sunlight penetration in between these rows, and you'll have a greater surrounding sun access for these trees. Now, I realize that this gets a little tight and it does not necessarily have all of the space, but that's okay because this is just a diagram for the pattern itself. And so once we have our layout and our spacing kind of figured out for our goals in our orchard, what we're going to be looking to do is figuring out how to maximize the sunlight capture in each of these gaps. If we're going to be running a truck or a trail through in this sort of layout, come on, pen, right? And then we would make our turn, and this is the way back out, right? Then our collection areas are going to be places where we have an option to fill these gaps with another type of smaller individual that will allow us to capture the errant sunlight getting around the canopy of each and increase the amount of photosynthesis in the system so that we can build out an even greater bevy of food and material for ourselves or for ecological service for the animals that are doing a lot of the management and cycling of the nitrogen and other materials and fertilizers on our property. If we were to go one step further, we could then say either we have groupings around each and we can alternate between our options, or we can have these blobs that incorporate a set of trees and a set of shrubs, or we could have patterns where there are clumps that intermingle and spread this way. So I hope that makes sense in a sort of way. And what we're going to talk about next is where this can potentially go once we have these types of ideas. So if we were to expand this out, what we have is just a layout of 9 plants, 9 trees, and perhaps that one serpentine pathway is no longer servicing the way that we interact with this system. Okay, so where we had one sinuous line through and back before, perhaps now we are finding that we are coming in and kind of making a small set of loops around these trees during a certain time of year, but that sometimes we will come out into here and check these two for growth and to capture, and maybe we'll come out as far as this, but then from here we have kind of a path that leads through. And so what we can start doing is grouping each of these into what functions as the guild itself. So we have our pathways, and now we have kind of these mental groupings in how we'd like to have this system interact, right? Maybe this is the northernmost section, and as this all filled in, you found that this chunk here was very shady. And so we're going to just take this one blob and make a few notes. And additional shade. It doesn't have a lot of wind, so it is moist area. It is cool. These kind of notes will help us to select from our bubbles and our options in the first chunk of this video. And that's going to kind of help to frame out our understanding of the next type of scheme or structure in our food forest. The last type of structure that I want to talk about today is going to be Minithickets. And I want to make a quick note that Minithickets can be used as a pattern itself, as part of our pattern language, to define how a large forested area behaves as well. It's just that the thickets themselves might not be so mini anymore. They might just be larger thickets. So if you are in a well-forested parcel or part of the country and you are working to build a food forest in a forest, I think this is the pattern language and the pattern to use for defining your forested space. And the way that we approach Minithickets is going to be the way that we approach a lot of our forested projects, because the behaviors and the methodology itself is very similar. So many times we may have woodlands, or we've purchased or live on an orchard that has fallen into disrepair, and maybe some aspects and elements have perished. Others have come into place. Some others may have grown in opportunistic ways, and so we get these patchy bits of vegetation, and we have these groupings, generally by microclimate or by another set of defining characteristics of that space in miniature. So things like a wet aspect, or a high water table, or even just this is a low spot or a high spot in the yard, will help to differentiate each of these spaces as we begin to define them. When we are thinking about how these items are grouped, right now we just have the trees laid out here, and what we are going to discuss is how these are grouped. And so you may have a set of bushes in here, and you may find, going back to our earlier convention, that they are of a particular variety and type based on this particular microclimate in this area. But in this chunk here, perhaps it's a different set. Okay. And so each of these smaller areas is going to have its own characteristics, and our job as the designers and as we are figuring out how these spaces are going to behave and how we need to think about eventually adding new plants, having this sort of general idea, this bubble diagram of what does well or what particular characteristics some of these spaces share are, and how those interrelate to what we're planning on growing. Okay. We can also think of this as rooms, as we've discussed in a prior video when we were defining space in the woods. So I might have an area that I am defining as here, right? And this might be the food forest itself, right? And maybe we have some herbaceous perennials and our ground covers in sort of these areas here, right? And perhaps this set over here is just kind of like your shade garden. And a hammock. And in here, we just have our tire swing. Okay, so we have an entertainment area, we have a place for solitude and relaxation, and then we have an intensively managed chunk of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous perennials, ground cover and things. Perhaps we have, very fragrant, small growing things in here. And we have our walking trails through each. Okay. So we have our little paths of ingress and egress. And perhaps we have some walking trails. I know this is getting a little crazy, but we're getting to the real fun part of all of this, I think. So we have our layout. We can go from a topographical map or a satellite view of our own plot and what we have going on our site. And we can start doing these bubbles and just assigning our understanding of these spaces and the way that this functions as a whole of the constituent parts, and how each constituent part seems to interact with this subset of bushes or this subset of bushes here, right? We can play with these interactions and look for patterns that repeat themselves broadly in our landscape, and then use that information for other behavioral analogs when we go to interplant. So how do we make use of all of the information that we've just talked about when it comes to the patterning of specifics. Okay, what we have is a given tree. It doesn't matter what species this is. It just matters that we know where it is and we have some additions or subtractions around it that we want. For purposes of this, we're going to say that group A is plus sun and plus aggressive. So sun-loving aggressive growers, shade-loving aggressive growers, sun-loving passive or slow growers, and then shade-loving passive or slow growers. Okay, so these are our groups, and these are the ways that we can think about what we want to have. Okay, so for purposes of saying Formidable Flora was asking about adding a pawpaw to the subcanopy of an area. And so what we know about pawpaws is that they need shade for the first few years of their life and will not grow aggressively during this time. So they would easily fall into group D. And what we would want to do then is to plan around minimal sun access. So we might want to have it within a certain space here, or we might want to tie it into a weaker afternoon light if we have a very, very high sun location. The further north you get, or the further poleward you get, the more I would advise giving towards early sun access, and then potentially thinning in here. But what we're going to do is we're going to figure out a spot where a shade-loving, slow-growing tree would fit in this context, and then over the course of its life, so we would say plant our pawpaw such that it is within the drip zone of this tree, and we'll get the benefits. It is in that area where it is going to be fully hydrated and has the protection from midday sun, but has early morning access to burn off dew and also to get the photosynthesis started. And so if this is the center of this tree here, as the pawpaw comes into its own, we can think about dropping sections of this tree, or we can think about a full cutback at a certain point. We can think about the water needs of both and try to figure out which way we're going to work these two together, right? I probably would say that this particular tree might be group C, right? We don't want something that is super fast growing or aggressive and going to overtake our pawpaw. Sitting in group D, who needs shade until it doesn't. But the idea is that over the course of the pawpaw's life, this tree is going to also be aging, and we may find opportunities or reasons to cut it back, scale back its growth, or we can coppice or pollard it so that the pawpaw itself has light released to it, and then will be the overstory for the younger shoots of this tree as they grow in, loving their sun access. So what if you're starting with an island or something to that effect, right? If you have your one island in your sea of grass or your desolate bare dirt lot, that's a great starting point. That's going to be catching fertility in the form of leaves or grasses or anything blowing in the wind. And if you have an island, you can very easily just add another, either in orchard spacing, such that you have an easy trees width in between so that you don't get interlacing branches, and you could run a tractor or a mower or a mechanized version of collection between, or you can make it such that they are going to be just overlapping crowns and crown space at maturity, right? So you can go from an island to either an archipelago or an orchard style planting, or you can start creating mini thickets and cycling the ages of these trees and other members so that there is constantly a state of flux and growth and regrowth in all of these systems that you have. Okay. These are very similarly to how we draw our diagrams when we're working from our broad scale patterns to finer details. These can be broad bubbles and just vague ideas of cooler, wetter, warmer and drier. And then we can start selecting for plants that will fill those particular niches. And then if we discover that there is another particular characteristic of this chunk here, what we can do is then we can further filter those plants to match the more specific needs, and we can cycle between a group of them rather than thinking, I'm going to plant a raspberry and an apple and a walnut, and that's my guild, and I'm going to plant corn, squash, and beans, and that's my guild. This method leads to, in my opinion, a wider selection of plants being available at the beginning of the design rather than forcing us to think about specifics that have been demonstrated to us. We can think about the broader implications of our plants and what their needs are and be able to fit any group of plants to any design given their availability and value of function to the design itself. I hope that makes sense to everybody. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us in the comments. If there's anything that you'd like me to further explain, I would be happy to go into more detail with these sorts of things. And if you are Dave Jackie or Eric Tonesmeyer and you think that I got something wrong, I would love to get together and have you correct me or have me go into greater detail of something else. As always, folks, thanks for watching. Happy planting.